Hi guys, welcome to HistSleep, the healing secrets of the colonial herb wives. Were their remedies lost to time? The air in the small wattle and daub cottage always carried a peculiar earthy scent, a complex tapestry woven from dried lavender, sharp rosemary, the acrid tang of pennyroyal, and the rich, damp musk of just harvested ginseng root. This was the sanctuary and laboratory of Mistress Alara Thorne, one of the last true herb wives of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the year 1745. To the fledgling colonial doctors, men often fresh from European universities, armed with scalpels, theories of humors, and a zealous distrust of female wisdom, Alara was a relic, perhaps even a danger. They called her a common midwife, a hedge doctor, and whispered of the fine line between her healing skills and the dark arts that had fueled the Salem Panic decades prior. Yet, when their own drastic bleedings and purges failed, it was to Alara's door that the common folk, and even some nervous gentry, quietly crept, clutching their sick children or nursing festering wounds. Alara's knowledge was an inheritance, passed down not through dusty academic texts, but through the hands and voices of her mother and grandmother, reaching back to the rolling green hills of rural England and deep into the newly discovered wilderness of America. The true foundation of her craft lay not in the European imports, but in the vibrant, sometimes volatile bounty of the New World forests and fields, guided by the quiet knowledge shared by the Wampanoag and Nipmuc people living on the colony's fringes. Her day often began before dawn, an apron tied over her simple wool dress as she traversed the dew-soaked edges of the forest. She carried a woven basket, her eyes trained to spot the subtle distinctions of the undergrowth. She knew where the boneset grew, its fuzzy stalks a sovereign remedy for breakbone fever, dengue, or severe influenza. She understood that the crushed leaves of plantain could draw the sting from a bee bite and the poison from a festering cut, a simple, effective treatment that defied the doctor's complex pharmacology. The end of summer was her busiest time. The fading light signaled the final, vital burst of energy in the plants. She would harvest goldenrod, gathering its bright yellow plumes for a kidney-soothing tea. The roots of the indigenous echinacea, a powerful immune stimulant, were dug with painstaking care before the ground hardened. But the most precious harvest, the one that truly defined her legacy, was the mayapple root. The mayapple was a beautiful umbrella-shaped plant, yet notoriously complex. Its mature yellow fruit was edible, but the root, the rhizome, was a potent, controlled purgative, used in minute, precisely measured doses. To a layperson, it was poison. In Alara's trained hands, it was a life-saving defense against chronic fevers and persistent internal blockages. This fine line between medicine and toxin, the very knowledge required for responsible dosing, was what separated the experienced herb wives from the ignorant and earned them both respect and deep suspicion. One particularly difficult tale underscored the precarious position of women like Alara. Young Master Thomas, the son of the powerful Deacon Barlow, had been afflicted with a terrible cough and wasting disease, likely consumption. The physician, Dr. Silas Vance, had prescribed increasingly harsh treatments, including mercury-based compounds that only weakened the boy further. Desperate, Mistress Barlow bypassed her husband and sought Alara's help in secret. Alara's regimen was slow, steady, and gentle. She brewed a tincture of wild cherry bark for the racking cough and a nourishing milk-based cordial fortified with the ground root of a local wildflower, known now as pleurisy root. She didn't seek to purge the disease, but to strengthen the boy's own inner fire. Thomas slowly recovered. He did not achieve perfect health, but he lived.
Deacon Bilo, faced with his son's undeniable improvement, did not thank Alara. Instead, in a sermon delivered to the congregation, he spoke of a miraculous divine intervention, adding a sharp warning against meddling women who presume to understand God's creation without the sanction of male authority. This was the core struggle, the battle between empirical knowledge, gained through generations of observation, and the formalized patriarchal science of the era. The herb wives were not merely dispensing roots, they were preserving a vast practical knowledge of American ecology and pharmacology. They kept this knowledge alive in their gardens, the meticulously organized patches of their yards that were the first true American botanical laboratories. With the rise of the medical establishment, led by powerful university-trained men, the methods of the herb wives were systematically discredited, deemed superstition, and even outlawed. By the time of the Revolutionary War, much of what Alara and her predecessors used, echinacea, witch hazel, valerian, ginseng, has been validated by modern science and reclaimed by the very pharmaceutical companies that replaced the herb wives. But the subtle, holistic understanding, the intuitive knowledge of the season, the soil, and the individual patient that defined their craft, that deep, intimate connection to the land itself, that is a story and a knowledge still waiting to be fully unearthed from the forgotten tales of early America. The quiet power of the herb wife remains a mystery, buried beneath the foundations of modern medicine.
Washington's forbidden fruit, the hidden plants of Mount Vernon. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth hung heavy over Mount Vernon in the waning days of the 1780s. George Washington, no longer the triumphant general, but the weary, meticulous farmer, walked his grounds with the same rigorous determination he once surveyed the Continental Army lines. His public gardens, the orderly upper and lower gardens bursting with neat rows of cabbage, asparagus, and ornamental flowers, were a testament to his character, controlled, predictable, and fundamentally Virgilian. They projected the image of the enlightened, successful landowner, the perfect figurehead for the new republic. Yet tucked away from the manicured lawns and the watchful eyes of his guests and surveyors lay a different kind of garden, a far more radical, almost clandestine space that represented not the public general, but the intensely curious, forward-thinking American. This was Washington's true horticultural laboratory, the place of his forbidden fruit. The forbidden fruit was not a single plant, but an entire ethos, the pursuit of economic independence through botany. Washington understood that true American sovereignty required escaping the economic shackles of Britain. That meant more than just winning battles. It meant ending reliance on imported seeds, crops, and materials. His hidden plants were the revolutionary tools of this quiet, sustained economic war. His primary ambition was to replace British grain and hemp with superior American-grown alternatives. He was obsessed with new varieties of wheat. He knew that the traditional Virginia strains produced weak flour and low yields. His records reveal an almost obsessive correspondence with farmers and diplomats across Europe to acquire hardier, higher-yielding seeds. He experimented with dozens of varieties, carefully noting the pedigree and Marlborough wheats in a segregated, experimental field far from the main crops. He treated these seeds like state secrets, knowing a successful crop could dramatically change the economy of the Chesapeake region. Even more controversial was his work with hemp. While hemp was a common crop, used for ropes and textiles, Washington was keenly aware of its superior qualities, which included both its fiber and its seed oils. In his diary, he wrote about separating the male and female plants, a practice known only to those focused on maximizing yield and potency. While the fiber was his public interest,
His detailed notes on the specific planting and processing techniques hinted at a deeper, more experimental understanding of the plant's full potential, pushing boundaries in a way that the conservative Virginia planters found scandalous. The true hidden jewel of his experimental grounds, however, were his attempts to cultivate rare, exotic fruits that defied the Virginia climate. Visitors knew his successful fig trees and peaches, but few saw the struggling, carefully sheltered rows of plants he risked losing every winter. Washington sought to cultivate the Mediterranean olive tree and the Sicilian orange, two species crucial for oils and citrus, which were cornerstones of European trade. He understood the immense value of an indigenous oil source. His efforts often failed, thwarted by the brutal Virginia frosts, yet he persisted, moving them into specialized cold frames and microclimates on the estate, treating each surviving sapling as a victory. His quest for a uniquely American staple led him to the paddy rice of the Carolinas. He saw rice as a potential food security crop for the entire nation. Yet rice cultivation was deeply intertwined with the horrific brutality of the slave system in the South. Washington experimented with growing it in the marshy areas near the Potomac River, attempting to adapt the crop to a northern latitude, perhaps seeking a way to produce this essential grain without relying on the deeply entrenched, cruel methods of the Deep South. His interest was not merely agrarian, it was geopolitical, aimed at making America self-sufficient in food. The term forbidden fruit also applies to the most human aspect of Washington's private botanical quest, the trees of remembrance. In a secluded section of the forest he called the wilderness, Washington personally planted and nurtured hundreds of native trees, oaks, maples, and chestnuts. He experimented with transplanting them, a risky process in the 18th century. But these were more than just forestry experiments. They were markers of memory. He planted trees grown from seeds sent to him by friends and admirers, each one a living connection to a decisive moment or a beloved person. When his adopted daughter Nellie Custis married, he planted a commemorative grove. When Lafayette visited, Washington ensured a special sapling was planted in his honor. These trees were not listed on the official surveyor's maps. They were known only to Washington and his closest, most trusted overseer. They were a vulnerable, personal acknowledgement of the life he had fought so hard to build, hidden from the demands of his public persona. In the end, many of Washington's botanical experiments, the olives, the oranges, the perfect cash crop hemp, were not fully successful in his lifetime. The cold Virginia soil and climate often defeated his grandest schemes. However, the true legacy of Mount Vernon's hidden plants is the demonstration of the founder's mind. George Washington was not just a general or a president. He was a revolutionary scientist who viewed botany as an extension of politics. The neatly tilled earth of his farm was his final battleground, where he fought the last vestiges of colonial dependence. His forbidden fruit, the plants that represented audacious dreams, scientific curiosity, and a quiet search for economic and personal freedom, tell the story of a man deeply invested in a sovereign, self-sustaining America, a history often overshadowed by the monumental deeds of war and statecraft. The plants he nurtured in secret were in their own silent way the seeds of the nation's future.
Poison Gardens of Salem, unmasking the botany of witchcraft trials. The air in Salem village in the spring of 1692 was thick with fear and the damp chill of a lingering New England winter. But beneath the frost, something was stirring in the earth and in the minds of the villagers. An insidious link between botanical knowledge and malevolent power was beginning to take root. This was the era of the infamous witchcraft trials, and the accusations, often rooted in mass hysteria and religious extremism, had a strange, overlooked companion, the garden's dark side. The primary figure in this botanical nightmare was not one of the accused, but the unseen force they were purported to wield. For the Puritan mind, any woman who commanded knowledge of plants outside the approved domestic sphere, the simple kitchen garden of mint and sage, was suspect. The deeper knowledge, the power to heal or to harm with a mere handful of roots or berries, was deemed a gift from the devil himself. This suspicion created the spectral, poison gardens of Salem, a concept more terrifying than any real patch of deadly nightshade. The reality was that the accused, the older, often marginalized women like Bridget Bishop or Martha Corey, were the custodians of essential, practical knowledge. They were the healers, the midwives, and the common-sense herbalists who stood apart from the official, scripture-bound male authority. Their gardens were not solely for food. They were miniature pharmacopoeias, containing plants with powerful, sometimes volatile properties. Take, for instance, monkshood, aconitum. Known for its beautiful helmet-like flowers, its roots contain one of the most deadly natural poisons. No Puritan woman would grow this in her kitchen garden, but the mere possession of a rare, powerful plant could be twisted into evidence of intent to harm. If a neighbor's cow suddenly sickened or a child developed a mysterious affliction, the herb wife's knowledge provided a plausible, albeit terrifying, explanation for the unexplained. Then there was the concept of flying ointments. In European witchcraft lore, witches were said to concoct unguents that allowed them to fly to their sabbats. These mythical mixtures often contained highly psychoactive plants. While no direct evidence exists of such elaborate concoctions in Salem, the raw materials were available. Datura stramonium, or Jimson weed, was a powerful local plant with hallucinogenic and delirious effects. While colonists primarily used its leaves for external poultices to relieve pain, its seeds, if ingested, could cause the exact kind of terrifying, vivid hallucinations that the afflicted girls of Salem began to describe, visions of witches on broomsticks and spectral figures tormenting them. Did the afflicted girls accidentally or intentionally ingest these powerful seeds? Or did the presence of such plants in the local ecosystem simply provide a ready-made vocabulary for their religious terror and psychological distress? The fear of the poison garden allowed the accusers to ground their spiritual anxieties in a tangible, albeit misunderstood, earthly source. The case of Goody Ann Pudiator illustrates how botanical skills became a legal danger. Anne, an older widow, was known for her nursing and midwifery. Following her arrest, accusations against her included the use of diabolical means to kill several people, including her own first husband and his wife, and to bewitch farm animals. While the accusations were baseless, her intimate familiarity with plant-based remedies and compounds, her ability to bring a strong, quick result, either good or ill, made her skill the very tool of her alleged sorcery. In a world where disease and death were often sudden and inexplicable, the herbalist was both a lifeline and a potential murderer. If a powerful decoction she gave to a patient failed, she hadn't simply erred. She had been acting on the devil's instruction. The line between a strong purgative, like the root of the hellebore, and a poison was razor thin, and in the hysterical atmosphere of Salem, the interpretation always favored the darkest possibility. Furthermore, the forgotten tales of the poison garden included the deliberate use of plants for contraception and abortion. In a rigid Puritan society focused on procreation, the knowledge of plants like pennyroyal or tansy, used by some midwives to regulate a woman's flow, was considered an act of defiance against God's will. Such a woman, who sought to control the natural order of life and death, was an immediate target for the witchcraft accusations.
Her garden therefore became a site of moral transgression, her herbs the tools of wicked autonomy. By the time the trials subsided and the fervor began to cool, the legacy was clear. The witch trials were not just a religious or legal phenomenon. They were a systemic dismantling of women's independent empirical knowledge. The herb wife's practical science, honed over centuries and rooted in an intimate understanding of the American wilderness, was replaced by fear. The true poison was not the hemlock in the soil, but the poison of ignorance and misogyny that flourished when practical knowledge was deemed a threat to patriarchal and religious authority. Their botanical wisdom was indeed lost to time, sacrificed on the altar of fear. Today, we look back and see the tragic irony. The same plants the colonists feared in the hands of a woman are now celebrated in scientific journals. The poison gardens of Salem never truly existed as dens of dark magic, but as the quiet, dangerous laboratories of the colonial women, whose sophisticated knowledge was the forbidden fruit that Puritan society could not tolerate. Their botanical wisdom was indeed lost to time, sacrificed on the altar of fear.
Dreamy flower that fueled a revolution, a lost cash crop's historic legacy. The flower was a thing of fragile, almost ethereal beauty. Its petals, soft as old velvet, bloomed in shades of pale violet, deep rose, or sometimes a startling snow white. To the casual eye, it was just another pretty bloom adorning the humid fields of the South Carolina Lowcountry. But to the planters of the mid-18th century, this was no ordinary flower. It was indigo, a plant of immense transformative power, known to its cultivators as the dreamy flower, for the mesmerizing, almost hypnotic color it yielded, the deepest, richest blue the world had ever known. Indigo was the economic engine that whispered of revolution long before the first shot was fired at Lexington. It was the South's great, lost cash crop, the plant that single-handedly provided the wealth and the economic confidence needed to challenge the British crown. Its history is a tale of brutal labor, phenomenal fortune, and a quiet botanical uprising. Before the mid-1740s, the American colonies were heavily dependent on rice and tobacco. Britain, however, wanted a reliable source of blue dye. Indigofera tinctoria, the plant species, was primarily grown in the British West Indies, but disease and fluctuating markets made that source unreliable. Enter Eliza Lucas Pinckney, a brilliant, determined young woman, barely 16 years old. She was left in charge of her father's 3 South Carolina plantations in 1739. Driven by a pragmatic vision for colonial self-sufficiency, Eliza defied common wisdom and years of failed attempts by others. She corresponded with European and West Indian botanists, meticulously experimented with seeds from various sources, and struggled against blight, insects, and the sheer difficulty of the extraction process. The secret lay not just in growing the plant, but in the alchemy of turning the green leaves into the precious blue powder. The process was torturous. The leaves had to be steeped in series of vats for hours, allowing them to ferment in a vile-smelling liquor. This fermentation was critical. The mixture was then stirred, a process often done by enslaved workers who stood waist-deep in the fetid water, to introduce oxygen. As the liquid oxidized, the dreamy flower finally surrendered its treasure. The particles of blue pigment precipitated out of the liquid, settling at the bottom as a sludge. This sludge was then pressed, dried, and cut into hard, expensive cakes. The true dark foundation of the indigo fortune was enslavement. Unlike the rhythmic, seasonal demands of rice, indigo processing was a constant, grueling nightmare. It was a race against the clock, with the steeping process needing to be perfectly timed and the stirring requiring incredible, back-breaking labor in the oppressive heat and stench of the vats.
The planters did not enter the vats. The enslaved men, women, and children did. The blue dye permanently stained their skin and clothing, a visible, indelible mark of their immense contribution and suffering. Eliza Lucas Pinckney eventually succeeded. By 1747, she had perfected the process and cultivated a strain of the plant that flourished in the Low Country's heat and soil. The results were electrifying. Indigo quickly became South Carolina's second most valuable cash crop, rivaling rice. The British, desperate for the dye to color the uniforms of their vast military and the clothes of their rapidly growing population, offered a substantial subsidy for colonial indigo. The price was fixed, the market was guaranteed, and the wealth poured into the Carolinas. This sudden influx of guaranteed wealth did three crucial things that directly led to the Revolution. It created a powerful, independent gentry. The indigo fortune transformed the economic landscape. Planters became immensely rich, financing the construction of grand city homes in Charleston and the education of their sons in elite European universities. This created a powerful, educated, and financially independent colonial elite, men who had the wealth and the confidence to argue with and eventually break from the distant king. It funded the Revolution. When the fight for independence began, the fortunes derived from indigo provided a significant source of capital for the Southern war effort. The wealthy indigo planters were the men who signed declarations, led militias, and funded the nascent government. The dreamy blue had given the Southern colonies the economic muscle to pursue liberty. But the legacy of the dreamy flower was short-lived. The war disrupted trade, and the British indigo subsidy, the plant's lifeline, was immediately cut off following the Revolution. American planters could not compete with the low-cost indigo from India, which was now backed by British capital. Almost simultaneously, a new agricultural marvel arrived: Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793. Cotton was easier to process, less dependent on intense technical skill, and its demand exploded with the rise of industrial textile mills. Indigo fields were rapidly converted to cotton fields. The sophisticated, centuries-old knowledge of indigo vats and fermentation, a knowledge held almost exclusively by the enslaved African and African-American workers, was abandoned. The dreamy flower disappeared from the American landscape, its legacy obscured by the blinding white of cotton. The historic significance of this crop, the economic engine that paved the path for the South's involvement in the Revolution, was lost. Today, small efforts are made to revive the plant, often focused on its historical and artistic value rather than its commercial viability. The story of indigo remains a poignant reminder. It was a beautiful, difficult, and ultimately forgotten botanical artifact whose brief, shining period of dominance provided the financial foundation for the birth of a nation built on the brilliance of an innovative young woman and the immeasurable, unrewarded labor of the enslaved. The blue that colored the world was the gold that funded America's fight for freedom.
Paradise or prison? The contradictory history of plantation gardens. The air at Belle Reve Plantation in the 1840s was heavy with the perfume of jasmine and the thick, sweet scent of magnolias. The main house, gleaming white against the humid emerald landscape of coastal Louisiana, was framed by gardens so exquisite they seemed to defy reality. To a visiting northern merchant or a European dignitary, this was a southern paradise, a picturesque, orderly vision of classical grace and natural splendor, a testament to the planter's wealth and cultivated taste. But beyond the sculpted boxwood hedges and the dazzling borders of crepe myrtle, the same patch of ground told an entirely different story. For the enslaved men, women, and children whose hands cultivated every bloom and trimmed every path, The garden was a prison, a highly visible expression of their subjugation. Where their labor produced beauty, they were forbidden to enjoy. This contradiction lies at the heart of the American plantation garden. It was simultaneously a magnificent aesthetic achievement and a profound moral horror. The aesthetics of control. The primary function of the main plantation garden was to project power and refinement. Drawing heavily on European Baroque and later Romantic styles, these gardens were designed to impress. They featured formal symmetry, long avenues of towering oaks draped in Spanish moss, and elaborate geometric flower beds. The order imposed upon the wild, riotous southern landscape was a metaphor for the planter's control over his vast human property. Every element of the main garden was a carefully curated symbol of wealth. The exotic imports, the rare camellias from Asia, the intricate ironwork gazebos, the fountains carved from Italian marble, signaled that the planter was not just a rugged farmer, but a man of sophisticated global connections. Yet this beauty was purchased with brutal efficiency. The sheer scale of the planting and maintenance required a dedicated year-round labor force. Overseers demanded perfection, often punishing the slightest imperfection in a trimmed hedge or a weed left untended. For the enslaved landscape laborers, often skilled gardeners and artisans forced into service, the beauty they created served only to highlight their own lack of freedom. They were artists in chains, forced to create a backdrop for the very life that imprisoned them. Gardens of resistance and necessity. While the main garden represented the planter's vision, the enslaved quarters and the surrounding forest housed gardens of necessity and quiet resistance. These were the true hidden plants of the South. In the small, sandy patches beside their cabins, or sometimes hidden along the fringes of the woods, enslaved people cultivated crops vital to their survival and culture. They relied on staple foods that were not part of the meager weekly rations handed out by the overseer. These gardens grew collard greens and turnip tops, staple crops providing essential vitamins and nourishment, okra and black-eyed peas, foods brought from West Africa, which carried a deep cultural and culinary significance, sweet potatoes, a high-calorie, easily storable crop that could mean the difference between life and death during lean times. These provision grounds were sometimes grudgingly allowed by the planter as they reduced his obligation to feed the enslaved population. However, they were fiercely guarded spaces of autonomy. They were one of the few places where the enslaved could make decisions, choose their own seeds, and labor for their own benefit, creating a small psychological pocket of freedom. Furthermore, the forests and fields were treated as a medicinal garden. Enslaved men and women, who often held a sophisticated, inherited knowledge of West African and Native American herbalism, knew how to find and prepare remedies for everything from fevers to snake bites. Slippery elm bark for inflammation, pokeweed for external applications, and vervain for nervousness were not found in the mistress's imported seed packets. They were found in the wild, sought out in secret, and prepared in private. A botanical power reserved for those without access to the official and often ineffective medical care of the plantation doctor. The mistress's paradox. The wives and daughters of the planters also inhabited a complicated space within the plantation's gardens. The mistress was often the garden's designer, the one who ordered the seeds and decided the layout. It was one of the few spheres of influence granted to Southern women, who were otherwise confined by strict patriarchal codes. But the mistress's paradise was also her gilded cage. She was surrounded by beauty, yet constantly aware of the brutal violence underpinning it. While she might tend her roses, the same hands that planted them might be bleeding from the whip. The mistress's garden became a retreat, a place to exert order and creativity. But it could never truly erase the moral stain of the institution funding it. Her beauty was sustained by the ugliness she was expected to ignore. A legacy unearthed. The contradictory history of the plantation garden did not end with emancipation. When the enslaved gained freedom, many carried their knowledge and their seeds with them, establishing new gardens of freedom. The traditional African American culinary and medicinal uses of plants, the very things that sustained them in bondage, became the foundation for Southern and American folk culture. Today, when we visit historic plantations, the formal gardens remain stunning, often presented as triumphs of early American landscape design. They are preserved as monuments to the aesthetic vision of the planter class. But to understand the truth of the soil, one must look past the symmetry and the imported marble. One must acknowledge the hands that tilled the ground, the seeds secretly saved in the corners of cabins, and the quiet, fierce knowledge of the medicinal forest. The plantation garden remains a powerful symbol of the American story, a site where extraordinary beauty and unspeakable cruelty bloomed side by side, forever binding the concept of paradise to the reality of prison. The true history is found not just in the elegant design of the master's borders, but in the resilient, life-giving plants that grew out of the enslaved people's meager plots.
Jefferson's Monticello. Did his garden predict the future of America? On the crest of a little mountain in Virginia stood Monticello, the personal laboratory and philosophical retreat of Thomas Jefferson. While the house itself was a monument to neoclassical ideals and democratic aspiration, the sprawling gardens and fields that surrounded it were the true living blueprints of the nation Jefferson wished to build. His elaborate, meticulously documented gardens, the 1,000-foot terraced vegetable plot, the 4-acre fruit orchard, the winding flower borders, were not just agrarian projects. They were a complex and often contradictory prophecy for the future of America. To understand Jefferson's vision is to understand his famous dictum: the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. His garden, therefore, was a patriotic undertaking dedicated to achieving botanical independence from Europe. The garden of a melting pot of innovation. Jefferson's famed 1,000-foot-long vegetable garden, carved out of the steep hillside by enslaved laborers, was an architectural and horticultural marvel. Divided into 24 distinct sections, it represented the very essence of American diversity and ingenuity. Within its fortified stone walls, Jefferson cultivated over 330 varieties of 89 species of vegetables and herbs, a veritable Ellis Island of the plant world. He was a relentless experimentalist, treating Monticello as a testing ground for crops he hoped would feed and clothe the new republic. He championed the tarragon and the lima bean, introduced new varieties of peas, his favorite vegetable, and obsessively tracked the performance of crops from around the globe. This relentless quest for the superior seed, the desire to cherry-pick the best botanical contributions of the world and adapt them to American soil, perfectly mirrored the nascent nation's ambition to draw the best ideas and people from every corner of the globe. His garden predicted an America that would be innovative, self-sufficient, and globally integrated, borrowing freely from all traditions to create a superior syncretic culture. This melting pot of plants, from French endive to Italian broccoli, was the edible version of the new American citizen. The paradox of the American agrarian dream. Jefferson's political philosophy, his dream of an empire of liberty, was anchored in the idea of the independent yeoman farmer. He believed that civic virtue and true democracy could only flourish when citizens were tied to the land, beholden to no industrial master or commercial speculator. The Monticello farm, covering thousands of acres dedicated to wheat and scientific agriculture, was meant to be the living proof of this ideal. His shift from the soil-depleting tobacco to the more sustainable wheat, which he often milled on site, showed a foresight that was environmentally and economically advanced. However, this prophecy of the self-reliant farmer was tragically flawed and inherently contradictory. Jefferson's magnificent agrarian laboratory, the meticulous terraces, the intricate crop rotations, the vast wheat fields, was entirely dependent on the forced labor of over 100 enslaved men, women, and children. The future America, as predicted by the Monticello Garden, was therefore split. It was a land of Enlightenment ideals for the elite planter, and a harsh, unyielding system of perpetual labor for those who tilled the soil. The beautiful garden was the product of a morally indefensible economic system, a fatal schism that would eventually fracture the nation he helped create. The flower garden, the soul of a gentleman. Beyond the utility of the vegetable garden lay the circular, winding flower border near the house. Designed in the English picturesque style, it deliberately rejected the rigid formality of European gardens, choosing instead to celebrate the naturalistic, winding beauty of the American landscape. Here, Jefferson nurtured both Native American wildflowers and the most prized European ornamentals, weaving them together in a display that was both wild and controlled. This reflected his hope for the American character, a blend of rugged, native independence, represented by the American plants, and the high culture and refinement of Europe, the imported blooms. It predicted an America that would value individual liberty and natural beauty, yet remain sophisticated and well-educated. His small, glass-enclosed south piazza served as his greenhouse, a space where he could grow tender, exotic species like oranges and acacia, plants that could never survive the Virginia winter. This was a symbol of America's ambitious reach, an attempt to control nature and introduce the best of the world's bounty, demonstrating that with science and will, the young nation could overcome any natural limitation. A prophecy fulfilled and failed. The Monticello Garden truly did predict the American future. Fulfilled, it predicted a nation of unrivaled agricultural diversity, leading to a food culture that would become a global melting pot. It foretold the American spirit of relentless technological and botanical innovation. Failed, it failed to predict a future where the yeoman farmer would survive the relentless tide of industrialization. Most importantly, it failed to resolve the fundamental moral crisis that sustained its beauty. The shadows cast by the stately trees in the pavilion fell directly upon the cabins of Mulberry Row, where the enslaved community lived and labored. Jefferson's garden was a masterpiece of planning and an expression of profound faith in the future. Yet, in its meticulous division between the ideal, the beautiful scientific crops, and the reality, the enslaved labor that cultivated them, the garden remains a haunting testament to the tragic central conflict of the American experiment. The questions that Monticello's soil still hold are the same questions that define America today. Whose vision of the future was planted, and whose labor was truly meant to harvest the fruits of liberty? The garden is not merely history, it is an enduring, beautiful, and deeply painful prophecy.
Indigenous Roots of American Botany, Tales from the Native American Apothecary. The dense forests of the early American Northeast held not just timber and game, but a profound, living library of knowledge, a vast apothecary understood by its first inhabitants for millennia. While European settlers, armed with their limited knowledge of Old World herbs, stumbled through the harsh new climate, indigenous nations possessed an intricate, sophisticated understanding of every root, leaf, and bark. This was the true, unacknowledged foundation of American botany, a legacy preserved and passed down through the Native American apothecary.
The story begins in the winter of 1621, near the struggling Plymouth plantation. Disease, or the Great Sickness, as the Wampanoag called the recent plagues, had devastated both the newcomers and the local tribes. The few surviving colonists were weak, ill, and wholly unprepared for the unforgiving cycle of the New England seasons. Their European remedies, based on outdated theories of humors and often ineffective herbs, were failing disastrously. A young Wampanoag healer named Weetamoo carried the knowledge of her ancestors. Her grandmother had passed down the subtle, sacred craft of the plants, teaching her to listen to the whispers of the forest floor. Weetamoo's medicine was holistic. It was not just about curing a symptom, but restoring balance to the spirit and the body, an understanding that contrasted sharply with the colonists' aggressive, invasive methods of purging and bleeding. When the colonists faced a severe outbreak of scurvy, a baffling ailment to them, characterized by weakness and bleeding gums, Weetamoo's intervention was life-saving. Observing their diet and symptoms, she recognized a deficiency. She instructed them in the preparation of a tea brewed from the needles and bark of the eastern white pine or the spruce tree. Rich in vitamin C, this simple decoction began to cure the afflicted, a miracle of survival rooted in local knowledge. The colonists marveled at the rapid recovery, attributing it to providence, while Weetamoo merely attributed it to correct observation and respect for the forest's gifts. Weetamoo's true apothecary was the entire landscape. She knew that the sassafras root, which the colonists would later prize mostly for its fragrant aroma and wood, could be steeped into a mild tonic for fever. She understood the powerful purgative properties of mayapple root, which the colonists required careful, respectful handling to avoid toxicity. Most importantly, she commanded the knowledge of the timing, when to harvest the root in the dormant season for maximum strength, and when to pick the leaf in the spring. The greatest medicinal treasure in the forest, however, was ginseng. For centuries, the indigenous people of the Northeast had known the value of the root, using it as a potent adaptogen, a plant that helps the body resist physical and environmental stress. The secret of its location and use was closely guarded, often revealed only to trusted healers. When the French fur traders discovered its existence, they created a massive export industry that nearly eradicated the plant from American soil, driven by Asian demand. The tragedy of this exchange was that as the colonists pushed further west, they did not seek to learn the complete indigenous science. They sought only to exploit the most profitable plants. The complex relationships between the flora, the fauna, and human health, the very bedrock of the indigenous apothecary, were ignored in favor of quick wealth and commodity trade. Yet despite this exploitation, the indigenous influence persisted, often entering American folk medicine through the hands of enslaved Africans and pioneering herb wives, like those described in the previous narratives, who maintained a cultural respect for local plants. They learned that witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, a plant discovered and used by Native Americans, was a potent astringent for skin ailments, a product that remains a staple in American medicine cabinets today. They adopted the use of bloodroot for skin treatments and dyes, and the powerful properties of golden seal as an anti-inflammatory and antiseptic wash. The tales of the indigenous apothecary are ultimately stories of cultural survival. The knowledge of the plants, their hidden powers, their precise doses, and their spiritual significance was a form of capital, a source of power, and a tool for survival against the onslaught of disease and colonial encroachment. This knowledge, carefully preserved through oral tradition and practical application, ensured that even as their territories shrank, their botanical wisdom endured. By the 19th century, this traditional knowledge began to be systematically collected and recorded, not by indigenous people themselves, but by botanists and pharmacists like those of the Shaker communities. However, these records were often incomplete, lacking the spiritual and contextual depth that defined the original practice.
Much of the subtlety, the prayers offered to the plant before harvest, the understanding of specific soil conditions, the combination of herbs used for synergistic effect, were lost to the sterile pages of the scientific ledger. Today, modern pharmacology continues to discover the very compounds that Native American healers have used effectively for thousands of years. The enduring legacy of the indigenous roots of American botany is a quiet, powerful reminder that the greatest knowledge often lies not in complex European theories, but in the intimate, respectful observation of the land itself. The true apothecary was never just a garden of herbs, it was a sacred partnership with the American wilderness.
Gilded Age obsession. Why did America's millionaires chase exotic blooms? The final decades of the 19th century, the Gilded Age, were a time of unparalleled industrial growth, dizzying financial speculation, and stark social inequality in America. While millions toiled in factories and slums, a new class of robber barons, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, and the Astors, amassed fortunes of incomprehensible scale. And how did they choose to display this wealth? Often not with gold or diamonds, but with petals and roots. They developed an extravagant, almost feverish obsession with exotic blooms. This obsession was not merely a hobby, it was a psychological battlefield where newly rich Americans fought for social legitimacy and status against the established old money elite. The grand, architecturally complex conservatory and its precious imported flora became the ultimate weapon in this high-stakes social war. The problem of parvenu power. In the eyes of New York's old guard, a man could not buy true aristocracy. Cornelius Vanderbilt may have controlled the nation's railroads and Andrew Carnegie its steel, but they were still considered nouveau riche, lacking the inherited taste and European refinement of the 400 society. The Gilded Age millionaire needed a means to instantly communicate that his wealth was not just enormous, but also cultured, sophisticated, and enduring. Unlike a gaudy diamond necklace, a magnificent orchid or a rare camellia required a confluence of wealth, scientific knowledge, and patient management, qualities that simulated the long-standing tradition of European aristocracy. The conservatory therefore became the primary theater of this display. These colossal glass houses, often rivaling the size of the mansions they adjoined, were monuments to excess and technical mastery. They required massive coal-fired boiler systems to maintain tropical climates in the depths of a brutal New York winter. To successfully grow a jungle's worth of equatorial flora on Fifth Avenue was an audacious, living demonstration that the owner had literally bent nature to his will, a divine right of wealth. The Battle of the Blooms, Orchids and Status. At the apex of this horticultural arms race was the orchid. The pursuit of these delicate, bizarrely beautiful tropical flowers drove millionaires to astronomical expenses. Unlike common roses, orchids could not be easily bred or propagated. They had to be violently extracted from remote jungles in South America and Southeast Asia, surviving a perilous journey by sea and rail. The cost was immense. A single, never-before-seen orchid specimen, a Cattleya or a Vanda with a unique color or pattern, could sell at auction for the equivalent of a modern luxury car. For a millionaire, displaying a rare orchid, such as the newly discovered Cypripedium rothschildianum, was the botanical equivalent of owning a priceless old master painting. It said, "My wealth is so vast, I can afford to sustain the biologically impossible." The social function of the orchid was best displayed at the grand evening balls. A woman's dress, her carriage, and her jewels were all scrutinized, but the rarest accessory was the corsage. A bouquet of comet lilies was a failure. A spray of exotic, out-of-season white orchids was a declaration of victory. The bloom was temporary, its beauty fleeting, which only emphasized the immense, casual expenditure required for such ephemeral luxury. The scientific and colonial imperative. The obsession also masked a fierce scientific rivalry.
Gilded Age fortunes financed private botanical expeditions into the remotest parts of the world. Men were hired to risk disease, jungle rot, and even death to bring back specimens. These men were known as plant hunters. The desire for exotic blooms was deeply intertwined with the colonial mindset of the era. Possessing a flower from the deep Amazon or the mountains of Nepal was a symbolic act of conquest, a small, living piece of a far-off, uncivilized land brought under the dominion of American money and technological control. The plant was a trophy, confirming the global reach of American industry and capital. For men like Henry H. Huntington, railroad magnate and later collector of the world-famous Huntington Gardens, the garden was a tool for self-education and elevation. He, like others, saw himself not merely as a buyer, but as a patron of science. By creating vast libraries and botanical institutions to house their treasures, they sought to transition their public image from ruthless businessman to benevolent cultural custodian. The gardens became a way to buy their way into history, securing a legacy beyond their railroad stocks and oil shares. The garden's quiet failure. Ultimately, the Gilded Age obsession with exotic blooms was a beautiful but deeply fragile illusion. The magnificent conservatories were not sustainable. They required constant resources, relentless heating, and endless acquisition. When the fortunes of the millionaires waned, or when the next generation proved less interested, the boiler fires were extinguished, the glass domes fell into disrepair, and the orchids perished. The Gilded Age garden, therefore, did not predict a stable, cultured future for the wealthy class. Instead, it exposed the vanity and desperation of the era. The beautiful but fleeting beauty of the exotic blooms served only as a temporary distraction from the brutal economic realities that financed their existence. The orchids were gorgeous, but their fragility was a quiet prophecy that no matter how much money was spent, the newly established social order remained as precarious and dependent on constant aggressive maintenance as the tropical flowers they so desperately chased. The blooms were symbols of power, but their roots were insecurity.
On survival, how early American gardens defined status and power. In the harsh, unforgiving landscape of 17th century North America, the first English colonial gardens were by necessity focused solely on survival, growing corn, beans, and simple root vegetables to ward off starvation. Yet, as colonies stabilized and wealth accumulated, the purpose of the garden rapidly shifted. By the early 18th century, the American garden had transcended mere utility. It had become a deliberate, highly formalized stage upon which colonial elites acted out their ambitions, defining their status, asserting their power, and laying claim to a new aristocracy. The shift from a simple kitchen patch to a grand pleasure ground was a declaration of permanent settlement and prosperity. To cultivate a garden that was beautiful rather than strictly productive meant that a family was secure enough to afford the space, time, and specialized labor required for ornamental folly. The display of cosmopolitanism. For colonial elites in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, the ultimate form of status was demonstrating a connection to European high culture. The garden became the primary vehicle for this display. Wealthy merchants and planters consciously rejected the wild, unruly nature of the American wilderness. They imported the latest European design philosophies, favoring the formal, geometric symmetry of the English and Dutch gardens. Boxwood hedges were meticulously clipped into perfect, rigid shapes. Flower beds were laid out in precise squares and circles, a visible imposition of human order and reason onto the chaotic natural world. The plants themselves were trophies. A garden was judged not by its quantity of potatoes, but by the rarity of its imported blooms. Tulips and hyacinths from Holland, or the delicate, costly camellia from Asia, often grown in small, heated enclosures,
announced that the owner had international connections and the wealth to sustain plants that nature did not intend to grow on the continent. To host a dinner party and serve wine beneath the canopy of a rare, imported linden tree was to communicate, without uttering a word, that the host belonged to a global elite. Botanistical conquest and political power. The colonial garden also served as a tool of political and intellectual power. In the 18th century, natural science was a mark of the enlightened mind. Men like John Bartram in Philadelphia, who founded the oldest surviving botanical garden in North America, blurred the lines between merchant, scientist, and landowner. Bartram's garden, filled with meticulously collected and cataloged Native American species, wasn't just a place of beauty, it was a scientific repository and a commercial hub. By studying, propagating, and selling American plants back to European botanists and collectors, Bartram asserted American intellectual independence. His ability to identify, classify, and trade the New World's bounty symbolized the colonists' increasing command over the resources of the continent. For powerful figures like William Byrd II at Westover Plantation, the garden was an extension of his political authority. Byrd, often called the father of Richmond, designed his estate to be a smaller, grander version of an English nobleman's seat. His formal gardens, leading down to the James River, were meant to be viewed from the water, a grand, intimidating spectacle for anyone sailing past. The garden was a statement. I have tamed this land, I own this space, and my status is permanent. The visible hierarchy of labor. Crucially, the exquisite beauty and complex formality of these gardens were a direct measure of the owner's human property and control over labor. The manicured lawns and perfectly aligned parterres required immense, non-stop labor. The larger and more complex the garden, the larger the enslaved or indentured workforce required to maintain it. The perfect geometry of a French knot garden or the vast sweep of a well-maintained lawn was a direct visual index of the owner's capacity to command labor that was constant, precise, and unpaid. A patchy, weed-ridden garden suggested neglect and failing finances. A pristine garden was the material proof of a successful, thriving hierarchy. In the South, the main ornamental garden stood in sharp contrast to the small subsistence plots cultivated by the enslaved population. This division was a powerful daily reminder of the planter's total control. The enslaved worked the mistress's highly ornamental beds, creating a paradise of leisure and beauty that they were forbidden to enjoy. Their own gardens, often hidden or relegated to marginal land, were focused on survival, growing West African staples like okra and cowpeas, a parallel botanical world that represented cultural preservation rather than public display. The rise of the ferme ornée. By the end of the colonial era, the ultimate expression of power was the ferme ornée, a style championed by figures like Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. This style cleverly blended utility with ornament, making the entire plantation a beautiful design. Rows of vegetables and fruit trees were planted in aesthetic patterns. This was the final stage in the garden's evolution as a status symbol. It demonstrated that the owner was wealthy enough to not have to separate work from pleasure. The planter's business, farm, was now beautiful, ornate. The message was clear. My life, my land, and my labor are all perfectly balanced, reflecting the ideal, enlightened order of the new American elite. The early American garden was never just about survival. It was a sophisticated, beautiful artifact that allowed colonists to carve out a privileged identity from the wilderness, to signal their cultural connection to Europe, and to visually assert their authority over the land and the people forced to work it. The flowers they chose, the shapes they imposed, and the fences they built were all silently defining the rigid hierarchy of power in the developing nation.
Final harvest. When did the era of the grand estate garden end? The summer of 1914 was, to the casual eye, the high watermark of American grandeur. At estates like Oheka Castle on Long Island or Filoli in California, the landscape was a tapestry of European formality. Meticulously carved hedges, acres of emerald lawn, and glass conservatories steaming with tropical palms. The grand estate garden, modeled after the aristocratic parks of England and France, was the ultimate symbol of American industrial wealth, a monument to the Gilded Age's belief that money could command both nature and society. But beneath the pristine surface, the seeds of change were germinating. The true end of this lavish era was not marked by a single event, but by a confluence of social, economic, and technological shifts that culminated violently between 1914 and 1929, transforming the grand, formal landscape into a relic of a bygone age. The shadow of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. When World War I erupted in Europe, it did more than just cut off transatlantic trade. It dealt a crippling blow to the psychology of opulence. America, though late to the fight, experienced a profound cultural shift toward utility and austerity. The manpower crisis hit the estates immediately. Young men, both sons of the owners and the skilled gardeners who maintained the intricate landscapes, enlisted or were drafted. A grand estate often required a permanent staff of 30 to 40 gardeners to maintain its perfection. This highly specialized, low-wage labor force evaporated virtually overnight. The symmetrical flower beds and complex knot gardens, which required ceaseless maintenance, began to show the neglect of a skeleton crew, if one existed at all. Furthermore, the war effort redefined patriotic spending. The immense costs of heating glass houses or maintaining elaborate fountains suddenly seemed frivolous, even morally objectionable. Land once dedicated to ornamental display was converted to war gardens or victory gardens to feed the troops and the home front. The ethos of the garden shifted from being a symbol of power to a tool of patriotism. The era of pure ornamental extravagance was deemed un-American. The economic shift from land to tax. The greatest force dismantling the grand estates was not a social movement, but the invisible hand of the government tax collector. The rise of progressive income taxation in the 1910s fundamentally altered the economics of inherited wealth. For the first time, millionaires faced significant taxes on their income, and more crushingly, estate taxes upon their death. Maintaining a massive, unproductive garden, which was essentially a constant financial drain, was no longer a sustainable luxury. The cost structure of an estate was brutally simple: labor, coal for heating, and materials. With rising wages post-war and high taxes on capital, families realized they were paying fortunes for prestige that was now considered passé. Owners of sprawling country houses had to find ways to liquidate non-productive assets. The land itself became too valuable to remain merely ornamental. This economic pressure spurred the beginning of suburban development, as the peripheries of grand estates were sold off as lots for smaller, middle-class homes. The new aesthetics, efficiency and freedom, the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties brought a cultural shift that prized simplicity, speed, and efficiency, values directly opposed to the elaborate, labor-intensive formality of the Victorian garden. The new American dream centered on the automobile and the suburban cottage, not the grand, isolated manor. People wanted to drive to their leisure, not host it on acres of controlled space. Horticulturally, this translated into the rise of the modern or naturalistic garden. Influential landscape architects began favoring open lawns,
easily maintained with the advent of the mechanized lawnmower, native plants, requiring less coddling, heating, and specialized expertise, the outdoor living space. Gardens shifted from being designed to be viewed from the house to being designed for use, for socializing, simple recreation, and practical outdoor dining. The era of the grand estate garden ended because the average owner no longer wanted the responsibility. They were tired of the constant battle against nature and the incessant expense. The garden of the 1920s reflected the modern desire for leisure over labor, prioritizing personal freedom over public display. The final cut, the crash of 1929. The final devastating blow was the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression. This economic cataclysm evaporated the liquid capital that sustained the vast, complex machinery of the grand estate. The immediate consequence was wholesale dismantling. Many famous estates were abandoned, and the intricate gardens were the first to be sacrificed. Heating systems for conservatories were shut down, freezing decades of exotic plant collections. Maintenance was reduced to zero, allowing the natural chaos of the American forest to reclaim the formal borders and statues. In a few iconic cases, like the sprawling Long Island estate of Otto Hermann Kahn, the houses remained, but the land was sold and subdivided. Other estates, unable to find private buyers, were donated to institutions, often becoming public parks, universities, or botanical gardens. This conversion was the final ironic act of the era. The exclusive, private symbols of untouchable wealth were transformed into public, accessible resources. The final harvest, the end of the grand estate garden era, was therefore not a single date, but the period between 1914 and 1929. The war made the garden unpatriotic, new taxes made it unaffordable, new culture made it unfashionable, and the Great Depression made it impossible. The intricate formal gardens of the Gilded Age withered not just from lack of water, but from the irreversible shift in the American perception of wealth, power, and the relationship between humanity and nature. The age of the spectacular, private botanical kingdom was over.